All right, give me a second here. Oof, okay. All right. We now finally turn to the economic part of this podcast, which will give a brief introduction to economics and then examine the present day division between positive and normative economics. In this podcast, I will argue that this division between positive and normative economics intrudes upon other academic disciplines which should be studying the subject material instead. Okay, what does that mean? We'll get into it, don't worry. Simply put, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. Burn that into your brain. Simply put, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. What does this mean? First of all, allocation simply means the distribution or handing out of things. So economics is the study of handing out of scarce things. But why scarce? If there was an infinite amount of resources being handed out, like an infinite amount of lemonade stands, a free lemonade stand that could hand out an infinite number of drinks, then that lemonade could supply anyone who wanted one, and there wouldn't be any way to study. There wouldn't be anything else to study there. So when supplied resources are scarce, however, that lemonade stand only has enough materials to make a certain amount of lemonade. There may be multiple ways to allocate them. Like the person within the lemonade stand could add more sugar, could have less sugar, more lemons, stuff like that. Um, if that is the case, then a decision must be made whether to supply resources here or there, and it is that decision that economics studies. Um, an example of a scenario where resources are scarce would be something like this. Suppose there are two men living on a desert island with one coconut, and let's assume for the sake of argument that it can't be shared. How will it be allocated? There are only three options. Either both men restrain from eating it, or one person might get it, or the other person might get it. This is what positive economics, the supposedly objective branch of economics, can tell us. However, positive economics can't go much beyond that, i.e., it can't tell us what ought to happen, only what happens or is likely to happen. On the other hand, normative economics claims to fill in that gap by prescribing rules for what ought to happen. That is, it claims to answer the question of which of the three outcomes ought to be preferred. This division of positive and normative economics is maintained today, as I've experienced at the University of Michigan, but there are actually serious problems with this split. Yeah, so this goes back to the rather confusing thesis at the beginning, which is that economics has set itself up as the science of human decision making, um, to force, like not allowing any other disciplines to jump in and have their say. Um, in the positive branch, decisions are, remember, positive meaning examining what happens or is likely to happen and not what ought to happen. Decisions are ostensibly analyzed with complete objectivity. That is, they study only that portion of human decision making which can be either quantified or measured without respect to moral or normative principles. Moral and normative here just mean ought or ought not. You ought to do this, ought not, you shouldn't do this. However, there are two problems with this claim uh, concerning positive economics. The first is that although it is certainly true that if an agent acts in their rational self-interest, then what positive economics argues would happen will happen, but it is only true if the agent acts in their rational self-interest. There are two options for positive economics here. It could either bite the bullet and say that its methods and practices are only contingently true upon some other moral principle which it can't analyze, or claim that the fact that agents always act in their self-interest is trivially true, like it's an axiom they don't need to prove. With respect to the former claim, the one about the positive economics being limited to um, only saying what is contingently true upon some other normative principle, this would concede the point that positive economics needs a normative argument at its very root, which again, it would not be able in it wouldn't be able to study. With respect to the latter claim, that the fact that rational self-agents uh, agents always act in their self-interest um, is precisely what is at issue, and so it would be begging the question just to stipulate it as an obvious fact. Even if the claim that agents always act in their self-interest were true, however, positive economics would still not be able to answer the question of whether this is the way it ought to be. Um, as if that weren't enough, there's a second problem with positive economics. Much of what positive economics argues about how people behave has been shown to be wrong by historical fact and modern psychology. For example, the idea that the free market will sort itself out in a way beneficial to everyone if everyone is just left alone, as Adam Smith claimed, is on extremely tenuous grounds. The historical record of the brutal industrial revolutions in different countries such as England, and all the moral problems that, such as child labor, seriously suggest that free market capitalism leads to monopolies rather than free competition, and that the brutalities of that time period, such as child labor, are not an accidental byproduct of the free market, but rather follow from letting greedy people do what they want. More on that claim in future episodes, because that's a hot take. Finally, modern psychology shows that people behave in quote-unquote irrational ways that don't conform to the economicist view of things. Examples include things like anchoring, social norms, and much more. I gotta take a swig here. Okay, all right. So that was with positive economics. Now let's look at normative economics. Um, the first problem with normative economics, again, normative meaning what ought to happen, or uh, yeah, what ought to happen or what ought not to happen. Um, the first problem with normative economics is that it has a seriously narrow and simply wrong view of the human being. The fact that agents always act in their rational self-interest is claimed to be the motive behind normative economics' takeover of the ethics of decision-making, but its definition of rational self-interest is an extremely materialistic and desiccated one. This wouldn't necessarily be an issue if economics restricted itself to the study of what is quantifiable, since what is quantifiable can only be found in measurable materialistic things. Instead, though, through its claim to know what ought to be done, normative economics is able to pass off all of its material presuppositions as trivially true when those presuppositions are precisely what is at issue. Remember what I said before about positive economics depending upon a normative principle, and that you can't assume that normative principle to be true, because that would simply be begging the question. What exactly are these materialistic, desiccated presuppositions then? We have already seen how dependent economics is on this idea of rational self-interest. The question of what counts as self-interest, however, is not a claim that economics is equipped to answer. The claim that people ought to act in their rational self-interest is a philosophical and not an economic claim, and must be defended using the means of philosophical inquiry. Does rational self-interest mean that people in fact act to make themselves happy? If so, then that means rational self-interest is assumed to be what makes people happy, which is an extremely absurd thing to posit as self-evident given the amount of controversy in philosophy over precisely this question. Does happiness come from virtue, a la Aristotle, or hedonism, a la Epicurus? What about the stoicism of Epictetus? The list of differing answers to what makes people happy is absolutely ginormous. So we are left with a conundrum. The claim underlying all of present-day economics, which is that agents act out of purely materialistic self-interest, is a philosophical one belonging to the field of ethics and not one that can be analyzed through the lens of the quantifiable, not one that can be analyzed through the lens of normative economics. If this is true, then economics must cede normative economics to ethics, which is part of philosophy, which includes the claim underlying, and also, so normative economics must cede to ethics, but positive economics must also cede its normative presuppositions to ethics as well. Anything normative in economics should be reserved for philosophical analysis, since economics studies things only from a quantifiable point of view. In this way, economics on its own would be restricted to positive economics without the normative principles, i.e., the study of what actually happens or is likely to happen, and it would only examine normative claims such as, the claim that rational agents act in their self-interest. It would only examine such claims contingently upon them being true. Like it can't say they are true. It just has to assume the fact that they are true, and then study what would happen if it was carried out to its full capacity. Oof. Okay, let's recap. Oh, excuse me. In the present day, economics is divided into positive and normative branches. The positive one studying what is or what may be, and the normative studying what ought to be. Oh, excuse me again, sorry. Oof. This division, however, is riddled with problems. Positive economics can't claim to be free of norms, since the claim underlying its analysis, that agents act in their rational self-interest, is a normative one and therefore at best can only study what is contingently true upon this claim. Secondly, modern psychology and a Catholic view of the human being both contradict positive economics' desiccated and materialistic view of the human being. Finally, the claims that normative economics claims to study through the lens of rational self-interest can't be justified through purely economic means, and so should rightfully be a part of philosophy rather than economics. In this way, positive economics must scrap its view of the human being and see the notion that agents always act in their self-interest to normative economics, and normative economics in turn must cede that argument and itself to a philosophical mode of analysis rather than an economic one. And I would also argue that their positive economics in studying what does or what actually happens must also cede ground, must work together with psychology and a not and a proper view of the human being as, body and soul, directed for the purpose of enjoying God in heaven. And obviously that's asking that to be merged with economics and psychology. It would be a little hard to synthesize all of those, but if you really wanted to study decision making, that's what that kind of division, that kind of unity is what needs to happen, that kind of talk between disciplines. So economics, again, like just sticks to numbers and can only study what happens. But psychology is a little more accurate when it comes to studying economic behavior, and shows that there are numerous things that we do that are irrational, that don't conform to Adam Smith's view of, everyone is just the most important, the most basic principle of human behavior is the principle to barter and tuck, to buy and sell, which is all itself on pretty tenuous ground. So, yeah, so I think that was about 15 minutes rather than 20 minutes, but that's about all I have. So I guess I'll say thank you all for making it this far, and please let me know what you think about this podcast. I'll try to put up a quiz or a sheet where you can record what you thought, and yeah, I'll try to change it so that it's more interesting to you guys and more instructive. All right, so I think that's about it, and so I'll say thank you all again for listening, and God bless. Thanks again.